They've stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state over a 23-year period. And that money should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and public services. Instead, was spent on villas and yachts and private jets. And that's a scenario where basically you end up with a possible uprising at any point. His accumulation of money was his objective, but now he's worried about the uprising. And so what does he do about a potential uprising? Well, he does what Machiavelli would write about, which is you create a foreign enemy and you start a war. And that's what the war in Ukraine is all about. And so I'd say his number one objective right now is not about money anymore. His number one objective is to stay in power because he doesn't want an uprising. Because if he has an uprising and he loses power, he ends up like Gaddafi with a bayonet through him. And so his main objective now is survival.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with the financier and political activist Bill Browder. He is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was banned from the country for exposing corruption. He now campaigns to impose sanctions against corrupt individuals linked to the Putin regime and to free political activists imprisoned by it. Bill Browder, good to see you again. Welcome to Frontline.
Great to be here.
So where do you think the end of 2023 leaves President Putin when you look at what he said and what President Zelensky said at their end-of-year press conferences?
Well, I think we need to separate what people say and where they are. Putin is putting on the bravest face he can put on, basically saying he's a winner, Ukraine and everybody in the West is a loser, and he's going to prevail. And the facts don't sort of support that. He's lost more than 300,000 soldiers. A good portion of his military has been decimated. His economy is in terrible shape. But he has one thing going for him, which is perhaps more powerful than anything, which is the ability to endure pain. He can basically continue to throw innocent young men into the meat grinder. He can continue to burn through artillery and equipment, and he can continue to destroy the Russian economy because he, and I should say the Russian people, have some unbelievable tolerance for pain. And it's been historic. They've done this for a long time, and we in the West don't. And so there's some chance that Putin will prevail because we give up on Ukraine, that we stop funding Ukraine, that Donald Trump comes in and cuts Ukraine off. And that's what Putin is waiting for. And so he's sitting there thinking that he can endure much more pain than we can, and he may be right.
And as we face 2024, did you get a sense of growing confidence in him?
Well, what he's seeing is all these squabbles. He's seeing the Hungarians blocking $50 billion of EU aid for Ukraine. He's seeing the Republicans, the MAGA Republicans in the United States blocking U.S. aid for Ukraine. And he thinks that he's on a sort of positive trajectory. If that continues, he may very well be able to win in Ukraine because they run out of resources.
On the subject of Hungary, you wrote an opinion piece in a British newspaper this week focusing on Hungary after it blocked that €50 billion EU aid package for Ukraine. And you outline a situation whereby world peace itself might be hijacked by one Putin sympathizing EU leader in Viktor Orban. Can you explain?
Sure. So basically, you've got this situation where Ukraine needs funds in order to carry on and defend themselves and potentially expel Russia from their territory. And it's a desperate need for funds. They're truly running out of bullets and missiles and all the things they need. And as a result, Russia is getting, at least in the short term, a military advantage. The EU understands that they need these funds, and they made a decision in the EU to allocate $50 billion, which is real money, which would significantly help Ukraine in the fight against Russia. But the EU has this terrible foreign policy, which requires every decision being made foreign policy wise to be approved by every single EU member state, which means one country can basically say no, and whatever decisions were made by the other 26 countries would then be abandoned. And that's exactly what's happened with this $50 billion package for Ukraine. And so you've got the situation where one country, Hungary, which represents, they have 10 million people out of 450 million in the EU in total, which means roughly 2% of the EU population, is vetoing $50 billion, 50 billion euros, excuse me, for Ukraine. And so what happens if the money doesn't materialize? Well, if the money doesn't materialize, I think we could see more Russian victories like we saw in Bakhmut and other places in the recent days. And perhaps Russia gets the momentum that they had first intended to have as they invaded Ukraine nearly 2 years ago. And perhaps they get Kiev. And that's not going to be where this story ends. Putin has made it very clear, and various other people in his regime have made it clear that they're not stopping with Ukraine. And what happens next? Then they make a move on Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia. And then we've got this terrible situation. What do we do then? Those countries are NATO allies. We have a treaty that says that we have to defend them. And so one of two things happens. Either we then end up directly going to war. When I say we, I mean the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany. And we're not only arguing then about money, but dead soldiers from our countries. Or alternatively, we make the decision that we don't want to go to war with Russia and we don't want to honor the NATO treaty. And then what happens? At that point, then Russia takes over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Maybe they make a move on Poland. God knows what. And so you end up in a situation which I would describe as effectively World War III, either way. And that all comes back to the $50 billion, which comes back to the decision by the European Union, which comes back to the veto by Viktor Orban of Hungary, who happens to be a Putin sympathizer. And so this is a very tense moment that we have, and a very dysfunctional moment for the world and for Europe to have the ability of one man in one country, a small country, basically hijack the security of the world.
The scenario that you outlined there is extreme, worst case scenario, and I guess not everybody's going to agree with that. But what do you think is actually motivating Hungary in its actions? Is it its domestic concerns and financial interests, or is it because of an affinity with Russia?
Well, the one thing we can't confuse is what Hungarians feel versus what Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Hungary, feels. Viktor Orban has mutated from 25 years ago being a sort of liberal politician to being basically a hardcore authoritarian politician with all sorts of terrible instincts, and particularly terrible instincts when it comes to Russia. And we shouldn't forget that Hungary was a country occupied by the Soviet Union. They were occupied in 1956. There was a uprising that was put down by the Soviets, and it became a completely overwhelmed country. And so they have a history with this. But in spite of that history, Viktor Orban has made this decision to align himself with Putin. I call him Putin's Trojan horse inside the EU. Now, what motivates him to do that is a matter of speculation. There's all sorts of interesting articles showing the palace that Orban lives in. Doesn't belong to him personally. It belongs to some other family members. I think his father. Where does that money come from? I don't know. But what I can say is that Putin has generally found that if he offers up inducements or perhaps threats to certain individuals, they go along his way. And for whatever reason, and it's impossible to know for certain why Orban is behaving the way he has now basically thrown his lot in with Putin and made Putin a very happy man. And we shouldn't confuse what Orban is doing with what the Hungarians are doing, because it's no longer a democratic country. He's gotten rid of all opposition newspapers. He's going after politicians that threaten him, and he's becoming like a mini Putin. And so I think that it really is a very dysfunctional situation, which is causing all sorts of stress and difficulties for the Ukrainians and for the rest of Europe.
And as you if you add into the mix the fact that at the moment Hungary has not actually blocked the acceptance of Ukraine accession talks to the EU, but that was only because they left the room when the vote was taken, so a loophole was found so that they didn't actually block it. And he's bragging, Viktor Orban, that he has dozens of future opportunities to do that, to derail the talks. How much of Ukraine's future is being decided by him?
Well, at the moment, all of it. But I would also argue that what he's doing is he's bringing this EU decision-making dysfunction right out into the open, completely in everybody's face, and other things can happen. I mean, I don't think he can play hardball like this forever. I think that there are provisions of the European Charter which allow Hungary to be suspended, and it may also be a situation where this unanimity, which has been plaguing the European Union for so long, gets changed. A lot of things can happen when you have a situation like this where it completely derails the functionality of the European Union.
And you argue that Hungary needs to be suspended from EU foreign policy decision making, or that the decision making rules should be changed. How difficult would that be?
I think it'll be very difficult. I think that it's an unprecedented situation, but at the same time, we're facing an unprecedented situation with this war in Ukraine potentially spilling over into other countries. And so at some point, something's got to give. And I would imagine European decision making will give before the threat to our safety and our lives gives.
And if you were to accept that President Putin's ambition is to disrupt the EU and the wider West, what level of success is he having in splitting Western institutions like the EU, like NATO, like the UN Security Council?
Oh, he's been remarkably successful. At the UN, he doesn't need to split anything. He can just step in and use his veto, which he does on a regular basis. But at the EU, because of this unanimity, but where every country has to agree, he's been able to find people to help him. And it's, by the way, it's not just Viktor Orban. The new prime minister of Slovakia is a Putin supporter, and so it's remarkable that 98% of the EU can agree on something and 2% can block it, and that certainly is something that plays to Putin's hands. And then we've also seen the same thing in the U.S. Congress. The budget for the United States government was blocked by basically a super small group of far right-wing Republicans who didn't want to support Ukraine, and they had to remove funding for Ukraine in order to unblock the entire U.S. government budget. Putin must be just laughing to himself right now that he's been able to achieve these results with such a small number of people on his side.
Yeah, laughing to himself, as you say, and appearing more confident at that press conference. He has one eye on the presidential elections in Russia next year. If he serves another full term, he will surpass the reign of Joseph Stalin. How is Putin preparing the way for certain victory?
Well, I think it's even an insult to the idea of elections and democracy to call what's happening in Russia an election. What Putin has done in Russia is basically create a dictatorship. Any person who wants to run against him ends up either in exile, in jail, or dead. And we saw Boris Nemtsov, who was a big competitor to Putin, shot in front of the Kremlin in 2015. Alexei Navalny put in prison. He's now disappeared. We don't even know where Alexei Navalny is. Garry Kasparov run out of the country, and many, many more. And so there is no election in Russia. Putin is the dictator. He's been around, as you mentioned, for longer than anybody. And it's his intention to stay until the end of his natural life, which he hopes to be a long time. And he will make sure that happens. And they will do whatever is necessary. They'll get rid of all competitors. They will stuff the ballot boxes. They'll just make it up as they go along. Because Putin understands one thing very clearly, which is that If he's not in power, he ends up losing all the money that he's stolen, which is an enormous amount. He goes to jail, and he probably dies. And Putin is a man who I would describe as a psychopath, and his own survival is more important than the survival of his entire country. And he'll do whatever he has to do to remain in power so he survives.
You mentioned the political rival Alexei Navalny. I'm also going to ask you about your friend Vladimir Kara-Murza in a moment. On Alexei Navalny, he does seem to have just disappeared in what was supposed to have been a transfer from one prison to another, as I understand it. Have any of your connections been able to shed on any light? Because there are fears for his life now. Oh, there have been since he's been incarcerated. But do you know anything?
I don't have any more information, nor do his lawyers, his family members, or anybody about where he is. And as you mentioned, Alexei Navalny is probably the most well-known opposition politician in Russia. Putin tried to kill him using the banned chemical nerve agent Novichok back in 2020. Alexei nearly died. He was in a coma. He had to be airlifted to Germany. He survived barely. And then when he was well enough to sort of stand up and move around, he went back to Russia, and he was immediately arrested by the same people who tried to kill him, and he's in their custody. And about 2 weeks ago, he collapsed. That's the last we heard of Alexei Navalny, and we've not heard of him since. His lawyers can't find him anywhere in the system, and we don't know whether Alexei Navalny is alive or dead.
Last time we spoke about your friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, another person who is incarcerated when he went back to Russia. He's stuck in a maximum security prison in Siberia. For people who are unaware of his case, could you just remind us about it?
So Vladimir Kara-Murza is also a member of the Russian opposition. He's a person who holds a British passport. He was educated in Cambridge and lived for a brief period of his life in the UK. After he graduated a university, he went back to oppose Putin. He's a close friend of mine because we spent the last decade together going to different parliaments around the world to advocate for the Magnitsky Act, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of human rights violators in Russia. He's a remarkably effective individual, politician, and I would describe as a true Russian patriot, unlike Putin. The Magnitsky Act was passed in 35 countries around the world, and it's probably something that Putin hates more than anything. And so when Vladimir returned to Russia about a month after the war started to protest the war, he was arrested, put on trial for treason, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. And I should point out that that twice they tried to kill him before after the Magnitsky Act was passed and before this latest incident, using Novichok as well. And so he's got all sorts of terrible health problems from those attempted assassinations. He's now sitting in prison. He's in a prison in Omsk, Siberia, and they consider him such a threat that they've put him in solitary confinement, where he's been for the last few months and where he's going to be for the next few months. He's in a cell 1.5 by 3 meters. There's a bed that comes off the wall from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The rest of the time he has to sit on a stool. If he doesn't do regular exercise, he loses the sensation in his feet from the poisoning attempts, from the nerve damage. He's let out of the cell for 1 hour a day. He's allowed to use writing instruments for 1.5 hours a day. The rest of the time he stares at a wall, and he's getting sicker and sicker from the after effects of the poison. I fear, his wife and his mother fear, that he's not going to survive another 2 years, let alone the 25 years that they've sentenced him to. And he is a British citizen.
The circumstances you describe are absolutely appalling. Is there any hope of his release? And what is the best hope of him being released?
Well, what I'm now pushing for is that the British government takes up his case because he's a British citizen, and they try to find a way to put the pressure on Russia, either through punishments or incentives, to get him out. He is a very famous opposition politician, very much like Nathan Sharansky and Vladimir Bukovsky, who are well-known Russian opposition politicians from the Soviet times who the West got out. And I think that it's really important that our new Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, does everything he can to save Vladimir Kara-Murza's life.
Have you had any response from him? Have you contacted him?
We have, and I think that he's going to meet with with Sergei's mother and wife in the new year, and hopefully we can make the case then that he should take it up properly and firmly.
Okay, look forward to an update on that. Putin has increasingly been clamping down on journalists and opponents alike in Russia. With the election coming in 2024, I know you don't want to call it an election. What does it say about his thoughts on any form of public say on his leadership since 2021?
Well, Putin doesn't tolerate any dissent whatsoever. If you say something negative about Putin, you go to jail. You say something negative about the war, you go to jail. It's a complete dictatorship. No media is allowed other than government-controlled media. No social media. No Facebook. No Instagram. No Twitter. Putin controls all information, and he makes it very clear to everybody that any type of dissent, leads to a catastrophe for you and your family.
How confident in that light do you think he is in his leadership now?
Well, he obviously is not very confident if he's removed any type of discussion, any type of opposition. What that shows is a man who's terrified. And he's right to be terrified. He's been around now going on 24 years. And the lot in life for the average Russian is a lot worse today than it was. And, he can't blame it on anyone else. It used to be, at the very beginning, he could blame it on other people. He owns it. And so he's really in a very difficult situation. And this war, of course, is catastrophic. It's created a terrible loss of life for young Russian men. 1 million Russian men have left the country. 330,000, according to last estimates, have died. Probably another 600,000 are disabled. The economy is in a terrible mess. And this is all on Putin. And so he's a man who's running what I would call a brittle dictatorship. And what that means is that it all works until the moment that it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, it'll go catastrophically wrong for him.
How long do you think he will stay in power? And what is that moment, do you think, where it won't work?
Well, it's impossible to predict. You have examples where it doesn't work. Tunisia, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, one fruit seller set himself on fire, and that led to the entire Arab Spring. On the other hand, you have Kim Jong-un, who's run a dictatorship in North Korea, and him and his father forever. And so anything could happen. It's more likely at some point it comes unraveled than it doesn't. But I don't think that it's impossible. I don't think there's any way that anyone can predict how, when, and where it'll all start. And that's why Putin is so scared right now. And that's why he's running such a totalitarian regime right now, is because he's scared. He's scared that when it all comes undone, he'll end up like Gaddafi in a ditch, with a bunch of people stabbing him to death. That's his fear.
How successful or unsuccessful would you judge the West to have been in applying pressure on President Putin through sanctions?
Well, the sanctions have been very effective. We've frozen $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves, which is more than half their central bank reserves. We have frozen most of the big oligarchs' money, so Putin can't draw on that. We've banned all lending to the Russian government and to Russian institutions by the international capital market, so they can't borrow money. The one place, though, that we haven't touched properly is the sale of oil. Russia is basically an oil and gas country. And as long as they're allowed to sell their oil, which they have been, they take that money, which adds up to between $500 million and $1 billion a day, and they spend it on funding their war machine. And so even though our sanctions have been crippling and highly effective in most areas, the one area where it really matters, Putin is getting a free pass. And so as long as he has that, he can continue to buy weapons, he can continue to fund his military, and he can run us out of patience. We're losing patience now. we're losing patience for funding Ukraine. And so effectively, we're buying the oil to fight for Putin to kill Ukrainians. Um, and then we're sending money to Ukraine to fight back, and now we're running out of patience.
And how confident are you that that money will be released anytime soon?
Well, I remember when everyone was saying we can't provide tanks for Ukraine, and eventually we did. I think that we're going to see that money get released, and what I'm starting to see is politicians coming in and saying that the money should be used for Ukraine, and specifically in Washington 2 weeks ago, David Cameron, the new British Foreign Secretary, came out and said it that Britain, and he specifically, would support freeing up that money, taking that money, confiscating that money, and giving it to Ukraine. And we're also seeing there's legislation. There's a piece of legislation in the United States Congress called the Repo Act, which does the same thing. And I think that as time goes on, the financial, moral, and political imperative will be to confiscate that money. And just like missiles and just like tanks, which everyone was hesitant to supply before, that money will go to Ukraine. And what I would also say is that that will be a big black eye for Vladimir Putin, who's just been laughing at us and about us. And when we confiscate his $350 billion, he won't be laughing anymore.
What's your understanding about? There's a recent report by King's College London which said neighbouring countries like Georgia, Belarus, Kazakhstan have been instrumental in helping Russia evade sanctions. What's your understanding about how that's working?
Well, basically, and it's not just those countries, also Turkey and many other countries. What we've seen, like 700% increase in those countries exporting certain products to Russia, and of course, I should say, there's 700% increase in us West exporting products to those little countries, and then of course that stuff is going to Russia. And so what I would say is that stuff is easy to fix. All we have to do is make life very clear to those people that if you do this, if you're going to be breaking sanctions, then we're going to sanction you. And I guarantee you, those spikes in exports to Russia would immediately stop. I don't think a country like Kyrgyzstan or Turkey wants to end up in trouble with their economies because they're re-exporting stuff to Russia.
And just to return to the future of President Putin, the Times' Michael Binion, he says that he could see a scenario potentially where he's promoted out of power and given a kind of ceremonial head of state role if Russia's elite feel he's become too disruptive. How likely do you think that scenario is?
I think it's extremely unlikely. Having been an opponent of Putin's for 15 years and knowing everything that goes on between Putin and the oligarchs, what I can say is that the oligarchs are all absolutely terrified of Putin. They're completely, they may be arrogant and wealthy and powerful if you get them by themselves, but the moment you put them into a room with Putin, they're like shaking little schoolboys with just terrified of Putin. And I've seen them in rooms with Putin, and it's just remarkable, the body language. And the reason they are is because with a stroke of the pen, Putin can impoverish them, take away their freedom, or kill them, like he does with the opposition. And we've seen this in real life in many situations, and they all understand that completely. And so, and probably the most relevant example of that was that plane that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, was on, which plummeted to the ground. And Putin made sure that there was somebody filming it as it was plummeting so that image stuck in the mind of every oligarch and every person who might want to compete with him. And so I believe that that's an impossibility. I don't think that anybody can threaten Putin. And of course, Putin knows very well that that there's no dignified exit, even a promotion, if you will. And so I don't think he's going to let that happen. And I don't think that the oligarchs would ever try to do that.
And yet, in previous interviews when we've talked, you've said to me that the one thing that President Putin, or the only thing that President Putin really cares about, is money, and that is the best way to hurt him. How?
Well, what I should say about money and Putin is that Putin spent the first 23 years of his presidency accumulating a lot of money. In doing so, he ended up creating a situation where he and perhaps 1,000 people around him have stolen all the money from the country. They've stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state over a 23-year period. And that money should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and public services. Instead, was spent on villas and yachts and private jets. And that's a scenario where basically you end up with a possible uprising at any point. And so I think the whole idea of his accumulation of money was his objective, but now he's worried about the uprising. And so what does he do about a potential uprising? Well, he does what Machiavelli would write about, which is you create a foreign enemy and you start a war. And that's what the war in Ukraine is all about. And so I'd say his number one objective right now is not about money anymore. His number one objective is to stay in power because he doesn't want an uprising. Because if he has an uprising and he loses power, he ends up like Gaddafi with a bayonet through him. And so,
sorry, go on.
And so his main objective now is survival.
What about the future of Russia? He's tried to paint the war in Ukraine as existential for Russia. How do you see the future of Russia?
Well, he's continuing to isolate Russia and make it more of an international pariah, and I don't see that stopping. And so I can imagine Russia moving further and further towards the status of North Korea as time goes on. He has no way of backing down from any of this conflict. Conflict is the thing that keeps him in power. And as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, if he succeeds in Ukraine, which God forbid he doesn't, but if he does, he doesn't stop there. He carries on. He's made it clear that that's what he's going to do. And so Russia is going to become a continuous problem for the rest of the world. It's going to be continuously isolated. The standard of living will decline in Russia, and it will become just a true menace to the world.
Just finally, as we approach the end of the year, I just want to know on a personal note what your ambitions are for 2024.
Well, I think the two things that I'm working on most aggressively is trying to free my friend Vladimir Putin from prison so he doesn't die in a Russian prison. And two, that the $350 billion of money of Russian central bank reserves that have been frozen by Western central banks could go a long way towards alleviating all this financial pressure on the West to provide money to Ukraine. Putin is the one who started this war. That's his money. He should pay for the Ukrainians to fight back, and that would solve a lot of problems. And so I'm working on that very, very wholeheartedly because I think that could potentially buy the Ukrainians a lot more time to push the Russians back.
Bill Browder, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.